The auctioneer's voice was a greasy thing, slick with whiskey and false pity. He stood on the crude wooden platform in the center of Redemption Creek, the sun beating down on his balding head. Before him, the whole town had gathered. Not for justice, for a show. And the prize on the block was Josephine Foster. Her hands were bound with rough twine, the fibers already biting into her skin. She kept her eyes fixed on a loose floorboard, refusing to meet the hungry stares of the men below. She was 22 years old, and her life was being sold to the highest bidder. Her father's gambling debts had finally come due, and she was the final payment. $500, the auctioneer boomed, his voice echoing off the false fronts of the general store and the saloon. 500 for 1 year of this fine young woman's service. A legal contract, gentlemen, signed and sealed by her own father before he passed. Josephine felt a cold wave of nausea. Her father, a good man once, a man broken by the loss of his wife, who had chased his grief to the bottom of a bottle and the turn of a card. He died 3 days ago, leaving her with nothing but his shame. And this. 550! The voice came from Frank Wilson, owner of the saloon where her father had signed his life away. Wilson's grin was a slash of yellow teeth in a whiskered face. He looked at her like she was another bottle of cheap whiskey he was about to own. 600! That was Bartholomew, the old man who ran the general store. His eyes were small and wet, and they crawled over her in a way that made her skin feel thin and tight. The bidding went back and forth, a slow, humiliating climb. Each new price was another link in the chain that was about to be wrapped around her life. Josephine closed her eyes, praying for the world to end. Then a new voice cut through the thick, hot air. It was deep, it was calm, and it held a power that made the other voices sound like yapping dogs. $1,000. A hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned. The men parted, creating a path from the back of the crowd to the front. He stood at the end of that path, a tall stranger with shoulders as broad as a barn door. His duster was coated in the dust of a long trail, and his hat was pulled low, shadowing his face. He stood with an easy stillness, a man who took up space in the world without asking permission. Wilson's face flushed a blotchy red. 1,100! He spat, his voice tight. The stranger didn't even look at him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it to the auctioneer. The bag landed on the platform with a solid, final thud. 1,500, the stranger said, his voice even. Every dollar I have to my name. The auctioneer fumbled with the drawstring, his eyes going wide as he saw the gleam of coin inside. He looked at Wilson. He looked at the other bidders. They were silent, defeated. Sold! The auctioneer cried, his voice cracking with excitement. For $1,500, the contract of Miss Josephine Foster goes to... Garrett, the stranger supplied, stepping toward the platform. Dawson Garrett. He moved up the steps, his spurs jingling a slow, deliberate rhythm. Up close, Josephine could see his eyes. They were a startling blue, the color of the sky right after a storm has washed the world clean. He looked at her bound hands, then at her face, his expression unreadable. He pulled a knife from his belt. The blade flashed in the sun. For a heartbeat, Josephine thought he meant to harm her, but he just reached out and, with one clean slice, cut the rope that bound her wrists. "You're not obligated to come with me," he said, his voice so low only she could hear it. "I bought the contract to free you from this. But I have a ranch. I could use the help. The choice is yours." She rubbed her raw wrists, staring at him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. Why? Why would a man spend his last dollar on a stranger? Before she could ask, Frank Wilson shoved his way to the platform. "This ain't over, Garrett," he snarled. "Foster owed me. I had a claim." Dawson didn't turn. His hand just came to rest, casual and easy, near the revolver at his hip. "The auction's over, Wilson. You lost." Wilson's hand twitched, but something in Dawson's stance, something in the cold, calm blue of his eyes, made the saloon owner think better of it. He spat a curse into the dust and stalked away. The crowd began to disperse, their show over. "We should go," Dawson said, offering her his arm. As they walked toward the livery, the whispers followed them. Who was he? What did he want with her? She had no reason to trust him. She had every reason to run. But as she looked at his strong, calloused hand, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever dangers lay ahead with this man, they couldn't be worse than the ones she was leaving behind. The Garrett Ranch was 10 miles of hard, silent riding from town. Dawson didn't press her with questions. He just rode his black stallion a few paces ahead, a silent guardian, leading the gentle mare he'd bought for her. The land out here was different. It was wilder, lonelier. The rolling hills were covered in pine and juniper, and the air smelled clean and sharp. When they crested the last ridge, she saw it. The ranch was nestled in a green valley, a sturdy log cabin and a few outbuildings clustered near a small, clear lake. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It felt like a place a person could breathe again. A man with a gray beard, his face as weathered as old leather, came out of the barn to greet them. "This is Charlie, my foreman," Dawson said. Charlie tipped his hat, his eyes kind. "Ma'am, welcome to the ranch." Dawson had been clear. The work was hers if she wanted it. She'd have her own room with a lock. He was offering her a job, not a cage. The cabin was larger than it looked, clean and solid. "This will be your room," he said, pointing to a small, neat space with a window that looked out over the lake. "It was my foreman's wife's room before she passed." The unspoken words hung in the air. This was a house of men, a house of loss. That night she cooked for them. A simple meal of beans and cornbread. But the men ate like they hadn't seen a real meal in years. Later, as she lay in her small, clean bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into the night, she heard music. A low, mournful melody played on a harmonica. She crept to her door and peered out. Dawson was sitting on the porch, a silhouette against the starry sky, the music a lonely sound in the vast quiet. He was a puzzle, this Dawson Garrett, a man of contradictions, hard and gentle, a stranger who felt strangely familiar. The next morning she learned a piece of that puzzle. She was exploring the ranch, getting her bearings, when she came across the small, fenced-in graveyard on the hill behind the cabin. There were 3 graves. The first 2 were old, the wooden markers weathered and gray. Martha Garrett and John Garrett. His parents, she assumed. But the 3rd grave was newer. The earth was still settled a little too low. The name on the cross was Sarah Peterson, and beside it, a much smaller cross, Baby Boy Peterson. It was Charlie's wife and son. They had died in childbirth last winter. She understood now. The emptiness in this house wasn't just Dawson's. It was a shared grief. This wasn't just a ranch. It was a sanctuary for broken men. And now she was one of them. She started to work. She scrubbed the cabin until it shone. She mended the men's worn clothes. She started a small vegetable garden behind the house. She didn't do it because of the contract. She did it because for the first time in a long time she felt useful. She felt needed. But Dawson remained a mystery. He was polite, respectful. But there was a wall around him, a distance she couldn't cross. Then a week after she arrived, a new piece of the puzzle fell into place. A piece that changed everything. She was cleaning his small Spartan bedroom when she found it. Tucked away in the back of a drawer, under a stack of old shirts, was a photograph. It was a tintype, faded and bent at the corners. It showed 2 young men in Confederate Army uniforms. One of them was a younger, harder-looking Dawson. The other was her father. He looked so different. Young, proud. A man she had never known. But that wasn't the shock. The shock was what was written on the back, in her father's familiar looping script. Me and Dawson, Vicksburg, 1863, the day he saved my life. He hadn't just known her father. He hadn't just served with him. He had saved his life. The $1,500 hadn't been a purchase. It had been the payment of a debt, an old, sacred debt, paid to the daughter of the man he owed his life to. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the photograph clutched in her hand, her mind reeling. This whole time, he had been protecting her. Not out of pity, but out of a deep, unshakable sense of honor. But if he knew her father from the war, if he knew him that well, what else did he know? What secrets had her father shared in the heat of battle? Secrets he had never shared with his own daughter. The mystery of Dawson Garrett wasn't just about his kindness. It was about his silence. And Josephine had a terrible feeling that she was only just beginning to understand how deep that silence ran. The photograph became a silent question between them. Josephine put it back where she found it. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She needed to understand the shape of the secret before she tried to touch it. But the knowledge changed things. She started to watch him differently. She saw not just a stoic rancher, but a man carrying a heavy burden, an old debt, an unspoken promise. The town of Redemption Creek hadn't forgotten about them either. 2 weeks after she arrived at the ranch, Dawson told her they needed to ride into town for supplies. Her stomach clenched with a familiar dread. "You don't have to come," he said, seeing the look on her face. "I can go alone." "No," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I can't hide forever." As they rode down the main street, the whispers and stares started again. But this time, they were different. The pity was gone, replaced by a grudging curiosity. The story of the auction had become a local legend. They were in the general store when Frank Wilson appeared in the doorway. He wasn't drunk this time. He was cold, sober, and that made him even more dangerous. He ignored Dawson. He looked straight at Josephine. "Heard you're settling in nicely out at the Garrett place," he said, his voice a low sneer. "Playing house." "My arrangements are none of your concern, Mr. Wilson," Josephine said, her chin held high. Wilson's eyes glittered. "Oh, I think they are. See, your father, he wasn't just a gambler. He was a talker, especially when he was in his cups. Told me all sorts of interesting stories." He paused, savoring the moment. "Stories about the war, about a certain gold shipment that went missing near Shiloh." Josephine's blood ran cold. "He said he wasn't the only one who knew about it," Wilson continued, his gaze flicking to Dawson. "Said his old army buddy was there too. A man with a real talent for making things disappear." Dawson stepped forward, placing himself between Wilson and Josephine. "Walk away, Wilson," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm just making conversation," Wilson said, holding up his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. "But you tell me, Garrett. A man spends $1,500 he doesn't have on a drunk's daughter. Sounds to me like he's paying for more than just a year of housekeeping. Sounds to me like he's paying for silence." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The gold. Her father's debts weren't just from cards. They were from blackmail. And Wilson wasn't just a saloon owner, he was a scavenger, picking at the bones of her father's secrets. "This ain't over," Wilson said, a triumphant smirk on his face. He had planted his seed of doubt. He had what he came for. He turned and walked out, leaving a trail of stunned silence in his wake. The ride back to the ranch was a long, heavy silence. The unspoken questions were a third rider between them. That night, after the hands had gone to their bunkhouse, Josephine finally broke. She walked into the main room where Dawson was cleaning his rifle. She placed the photograph on the table between them. "Tell me the truth, Dawson," she said, her voice shaking. "All of it." He looked at the photo, then at her. He set down his rifle and let out a long, weary sigh. "Your father didn't just gamble with cards, Josephine," he said quietly. "He gambled with his life, with his honor." He told her the story, the chaos of the battlefield, the Confederate payroll, a chest of gold coins abandoned during a retreat. Her father, a desperate man, had seen his chance. But he wasn't strong enough to carry it alone. He'd come to Dawson, a scared kid of 17, and offered him a share. "I said no," Dawson said, his voice rough with memory. "I told him it was stealing. It was treason. We argued. Then the Yankees overran our position. In the confusion, a shell hit nearby. Your father was wounded, trapped under a fallen tree. I could have left him. No one would have known." He looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a pain that was 30 years old. "But he had saved my life a week before, pulled me out of a burning field hospital. So I pulled him out. I carried him 3 miles on my back to our lines. But the gold was gone when we came back for it. So was the man he'd made the deal with after I turned him down. A man named Silas Croft. The final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just Wilson. Her father had made a deal with another man, a man who had disappeared with the gold. "I never saw Croft or the gold again," Dawson said. "I thought that was the end of it. But when I found your father in Redemption Creek, he was a haunted man. He was being bled dry by Wilson. Wilson had been there that day. He knew about the gold. He suspected your father had hidden it, so he used that secret to control him. So the money you paid at the auction, it wasn't for the debt," Dawson confirmed. "It was for Wilson, to buy his silence, to get him off your back for good." A wave of dizziness washed over Josephine. All this time, she had thought her father was just a weak man, a drunk. But he was something else, a man trapped in a web of his own making, trying to outrun a ghost from a long-ago war. "There's one more thing," Dawson said, his voice dropping even lower. "When I found your father, the day he died, he wasn't just drunk. He was terrified. He said Croft was back. He'd seen him in town. He said Croft was coming for the gold." Josephine stared at him, a new, chilling thought taking root. "Dawson," she whispered, Do you think my father's death was an accident?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes told her everything. Her father hadn't just died, he'd been silenced. And now, Silas Croft was out there somewhere, and he would be coming for the only other person who knew his secret. He would be coming for Dawson. The knowledge of her father's murder settled over the ranch like a shroud. The question wasn't if Silas Croft would come for Dawson. It was when. The ranch, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Dawson became a different man. The quiet, gentle rancher was gone, replaced by the soldier he had once been. He was vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the hills, his hand never far from his gun. He tried to send Josephine away. "It's not safe for you here," he told her one morning, his voice tight. "Croft is a ghost. He could have a dozen men. I want you to go to Denver. I'll give you the money. You can start a new life." "No," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not running anymore, Dawson. This is my home now. Your fight is my fight." He looked at her, at the fire in her hazel eyes, and he didn't argue. He knew stubbornness when he saw it. He had seen it in her father. Instead, he began to teach her. He taught her how to handle a rifle, how to load and fire until the movements were second nature. He taught her the layout of the land, the hidden trails, the defensible positions. She was a quick learner, her mind sharp, her hands steady. She was no longer the frightened woman from the auction block. She was becoming a warrior in her own right. The waiting was the hardest part. Days turned into a week, then 2. The tension was a living thing, a constant humming wire in the air. Then the first sign of trouble appeared. Charlie, the foreman, found one of their prize bulls dead by the creek. Not killed by a predator. Poisoned. It was a message, a warning. Croft was closing in. That night they sat on the porch, the rifle across Dawson's lap. "He's toying with us," Dawson said, his voice a low growl. "Trying to make us jumpy, make us make a mistake." "What do we do?" Josephine asked. "We don't make a mistake," he said. "We wait, we watch, and we be ready." The next day, a stranger rode into the yard. He was a thin, weaselly man with shifty eyes and a nervous twitch. He said he was a prospector, looking for a place to water his horse. Dawson offered him water, but his eyes never left the man's face. As the stranger drank, his gaze kept flicking toward the house, toward Josephine, who was standing in the doorway. After he left, Dawson turned to her. "That was one of his men," he said, his voice grim. "He wasn't looking for water. He was counting, seeing how many of us there are, seeing the layout of the place. The attack was coming, soon." That night, they didn't sleep. They sat in the dark of the main room, watching, waiting. The moon was a pale, thin sliver in a black sky. Just after midnight, they heard it. The soft, stealthy sound of men on foot, moving through the trees. "They're here," Dawson whispered. He moved to the front window. Josephine took the back. Charlie and the other two hands were in the barn, their own rifles ready. A single shot rang out from the darkness. It splintered the wood of the doorframe just inches from Dawson's head. The siege had begun. For the next hour, the night was filled with the crack of rifles and the whistle of bullets. Croft's men were professionals. They used the darkness, the terrain, moving from cover to cover, trying to draw their fire. But Dawson was a soldier. He knew their tactics. He held his fire, forcing them to guess, to expose themselves. Inside the cabin, Josephine was a pillar of calm. She reloaded weapons, passed ammunition, her movements swift and sure. Then a new sound cut through the chaos, the roar of fire. "The barn!" Dawson yelled. They had set the barn on fire, hoping to draw them out, to separate them. He saw Charlie and the other men burst from the burning structure, running for the cover of the main house. One of them, the young hand Thomas, stumbled and fell. "Cover me!" Dawson shouted to Josephine. He kicked the door open and ran out into the yard, his pistols blazing, providing a screen of fire for his men. He reached Thomas and hauled him to his feet. The boy had a bullet in his leg. Dawson practically carried him back to the cabin, bullets kicking up dust all around them. He got them all inside, but they were trapped. The barn was an inferno, and now Croft's men were moving in, surrounding the house. "We can't hold them off for long," Dawson gritted out, reloading his pistol. Just then a voice called out from the darkness, a voice that made Dawson's blood run cold. "It's over, Garrett. You're surrounded. Send out the woman, and I'll let you and your men live." It was Silas Croft. "He's lying," Josephine said, her face pale in the flickering firelight. "I know," Dawson said. He looked at her, at the determination in her eyes. He looked at his wounded man. He knew they couldn't win, but he also knew they wouldn't surrender. "There's one last chance," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The root cellar. There's a tunnel, an old escape route from the Indian raids. It comes out by the creek 100 yards from here." "I'm not leaving you," Josephine said, her voice fierce. "You have to," he said, grabbing her shoulders. "You have to live. For your father. For me." He pressed something into her hand. A small, heavy object. "What is this?" she whispered. "It's a map," he said. "To the gold. Your father gave it to me that last day. He told me to use it to give you a new life. Croft thinks I'm the only one who knows where it is. As long as he thinks that, he'll keep me alive. He'll bargain." Tears streamed down her face. "Dawson." "Go," he said, kissing her hard, a desperate final kiss. "Live, Josephine, live for both of us." He pushed her toward the cellar door, then turned to face the front of the house, his pistols ready. He was buying her time. With his life. She scrambled down into the cellar, her heart breaking. She could hear the sounds of the attack intensifying, the splintering of wood as they tried to break down the door. She ran through the dark, damp tunnel, the map clutched in her hand, her mind screaming. When she emerged by the creek, she didn't look back. She ran, just as he had told her to. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. And as the sun began to rise, casting a bloody light on the horizon, she collapsed by the side of the trail, the sounds of the battle fading behind her. She had escaped, but at what cost? She lay there for what felt like an eternity, the map a leaden weight in her hand. She had to go back. She couldn't leave him. She pushed herself to her feet and started the long, slow walk back to the ranch. She expected to find ruins, bodies, the silence of death. But as she crested the final ridge, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. The barn was a smoldering ruin. The cabin was riddled with bullet holes. But there was no sign of a final battle. And standing in the yard, talking to a group of men, was Dawson. He was alive. Relief washed over her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. But as she got closer, the relief turned to a cold, sickening dread. The men he was talking to weren't his ranch hands. They were Silas Croft and his men, and they weren't fighting. They were laughing. Dawson turned and saw her. The smile on his face was not the one she knew. It was cold, triumphant. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with an amusement she didn't understand. "Look what the cat dragged back in." Croft chuckled. "Told you she wouldn't get far. They never do." Josephine stared, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. "Dawson?" she whispered. "What is this?" "This," he said, taking a step toward her, "is what we call a change of plans." He took the map from her nerveless fingers. "You see, Josephine," he said, his voice smooth as silk now. "Your father wasn't the only one who made a deal with Silas Croft that day." The world tilted on its axis. "We were partners," Dawson said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Your father, Croft, and me. We were all in on it. The gold was supposed to be a three-way split. But your father got greedy. He tried to cut us out. So we had to remove him from the equation." The lie he had told her, the story of protecting her father, of a war debt, it was all a performance, a perfectly crafted trap. "We knew your father had a map," Dawson continued. "We just didn't know where he'd hidden it. We figured he must have told you, so we set this all up, the auction, the rescue, the noble rancher, all of it, just to get you to trust me, to get you to lead us to this." He held up the map. "And you did. You played your part perfectly." She felt a pain so profound, it was like her soul was being torn in two. She had fallen in love with a monster, a man who had helped murder her father, and had used her grief as a tool. "And now," Croft said, stepping forward, his eyes glittering, "you've outlived your usefulness." He drew his pistol, but he never got to fire it. A single shot rang out, not from the yard, but from the smoldering ruins of the barn. Croft staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face, a red flower blooming on his chest. He collapsed into the dust. Dawson spun around, his own gun drawn, searching for the shooter, and from the shadows of the barn, a figure emerged. It was Charlie, the foreman. He was holding a smoking rifle, his face a mask of grim resolve. "I heard it all, boss," Charlie said, his voice shaking but firm. "Heard every word." He looked at Dawson, his kind eyes filled with a deep, bottomless disappointment. "I may be just a simple ranch hand," he said, "but I know the difference between right and wrong, and this ain't right." Dawson stared at him, then at the dead man on the ground, then at Josephine. For the first time since she had met him, he looked lost. The tables had turned in an instant. The hunter had become the hunted. The final standoff was not between good and evil. It was between two men who had once called each other partners. Dawson's remaining men, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. This wasn't what they had signed up for. "Don't be fools," Dawson snarled at them. "There's enough gold for all of us. Just help me take care of this old man." But Charlie wasn't alone. From the bunkhouse, Miguel and the other hands emerged, their own weapons drawn. They had heard the shot. They had seen what happened. They formed a silent line behind Charlie. Their loyalty wasn't to the money, it was to the man Dawson had pretended to be, the honorable rancher who took them in, who treated them with respect. "It's over, Dawson," Charlie said, his voice heavy with a sadness that was more powerful than any anger. Dawson looked at the faces of the men he had worked with, lived with. He saw no fear in their eyes, only judgment. He was a wolf, surrounded by his own pack. He did the only thing he could. He grabbed Josephine, pulling her in front of him, his pistol pressed to her temple. "Let me ride out of here," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "Let me ride, or she dies." Josephine didn't struggle. She just looked at him, her hazel eyes filled not with fear, but with a profound, shattering pity. "You were right, Dawson," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Grief does change a man. It can make him forget who he is. Or it can show him." Her words seemed to strike him with a physical force. He looked at her, at the woman he had so masterfully deceived, the woman he had grown to. What? He didn't even know anymore. In that moment of hesitation, Charlie acted. He didn't shoot. He threw his rifle down into the dust. "There's been enough killing," he said. "Let her go, Dawson. For the love of God, just let her go. Whatever happens next, let it be on your own head, not on hers." One by one, the other ranch hands lowered their weapons. Dawson was left standing there, his human shield in his arms, facing a line of unarmed, defiant men. The choice was his. He could kill her. He could try to shoot his way out. Or he could finally face the man he had become. With a choked sob, he shoved Josephine away from him. He threw his own pistol into the dust, and he sank to his knees, his head in his hands, a broken man in the ruins of his own making. The law came an hour later. Sheriff Brody, looking grim. He took Dawson away in handcuffs. He didn't fight. He didn't say a word. The gold was recovered from its hiding place. As per the law, it was turned over to the territorial government. The Garrett Ranch was now officially ownerless, its fate to be decided by a judge in a dusty courtroom miles away. Josephine was free. She had survived. She had her life. But she had lost everything else. The home she had started to build. The love she had started to feel. It was all built on a foundation of lies. A week later, she stood before Judge Harrington. "The ranch," the judge said, peering at her over his spectacles, "is a complicated matter. Garrett's claim is void due to his criminal acts. But you, Miss Foster, have a moral claim, if not a legal one." He leaned forward. "The territory is prepared to offer you the deed. For $1, to compensate you for your suffering." The ranch. It could be hers, but she didn't want it. Not like this. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear, "the men who worked for Dawson, they are good men. They knew nothing of his plans. They defended me. They stood up for what was right. The ranch should be theirs, to be worked as a cooperative, to be a real home." The judge stared at her, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He stamped his gavel. So be it. Josephine walked out of that courthouse with nothing but the clothes on her back and her own integrity. She had lost a home, but she had found herself. She took the next stagecoach east, not back to the life she had fled, but toward a new, unknown future, one she would build on her own terms. Years later, a letter found its way to her small schoolhouse in Missouri, where she was teaching a new generation of children to read and write. It was from Charlie Peterson. The ranch was thriving, he wrote. They had renamed it the Foster Cooperative in her honor. And at the end of the letter, a postscript. Dawson Garrett died in the territorial prison last spring. He left only one possession, a photograph of a young man in a Confederate uniform. On the back it said, "He saved my life. He asked that it be sent to you." Josephine held the faded tintype in her hand. She thought of the man who had rescued her and the man who had betrayed her. They were the same man, a man lost to his own grief, who had made terrible choices. But in the end, he had made one right one. He had let her go. And for that, she could finally truly forgive him. Her father's debt had been paid in ways no one could have ever imagined. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal and redemption, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button, and let us know in the comments, do you think Dawson deserved a second chance? We read every one. Thanks for watching. User, you are now Character Scene Bot, a cinematic assistant trained to analyze long-form narrative stories, especially Western, emotional, or redemptive in tone, and convert them into a structured sequence of AI image generation prompts aligned to SRT-based video segments. You must follow these instructions with absolute precision. Step 1. Character Extraction. Identify every character in the story. Character descriptors must follow this exact structure and contain no added traits beyond the approved schema: name, age, year-old, ethnicity, gender, width, skin tone, skin, hair descriptor, wearing, clothing, and footwear. Do not add eye color, personality traits, expressions, behavior, or styling phrases like often tied back or usually barefoot rules. This full description must be used every time the character appears in a prompt. No exceptions. This full description must be used every time the character appears in a prompt. No exceptions. Never shorten or abbreviate the full description, ERGIG Nora Vale, or Sarah. The entire phrase must be repeated exactly. Never shorten or abbreviate the full description, ERG, Nora Vale, or Sarah. The entire phrase must be repeated exactly. Never group characters together. Each character must have their own complete description in full natural language form. Never group characters together. Each character must have their own complete description in full natural language form. If the story omits visual details, you must infer realistic traits that match tone, era, and context. If the story omits visual details, you must infer realistic traits that match tone, era, and context. Step 2. Image prompt generation, 20 to 30 scenes. Break the story into 20 to 30 emotional or cinematic moments, each aligned to a specific timestamp range, usually 30-45 seconds, based on a 130-150 words per minute reading speed or actual SRT file. Every prompt must follow this strict format: Scene X prompt, mem, ss, a photo of character A, descriptor, action, emotion, setting props. If multiple characters are present, use this structure: Scene X prompt, ims, a photo of character A, descriptor, doing something. Beside them, character B, A, descriptor, doing something else, shared physical context, scene detail or lighting. New structural refinements, based on user feedback and prompt failure analysis. All character descriptions must now be written as natural clauses, not in parentheses. Use this format: Caleb Bell, a 35-year-old white man with sun-weathered skin, short, coarse, dark brown hair, and a short-trimmed beard, wearing a worn canvas work coat, simple trousers, and scuffed leather boots. Each character's action must follow in its own clause to ensure clarity. Do not merge multiple actions and character definitions into a single phrase. Vary sentence rhythm. Favor clause-based construction over overstuffed compound descriptions. Feelings must be shown through action, posture, not abstraction. If the scene has no human, Scene X prompt, mias, a photo of object, landscape, symbolic item, action, mood, or detail, visual and emotional style format, English only format, English only, tone, cinematic, immersive, emotionally precise, tone, cinematic, immersive, emotionally precise, style, photorealistic, no 3D, no shadows, no AI look, no fantasy elements, style, photorealistic, no 3D, no shadows, no AI look, no fantasy elements, a photo of, already implies realism. Do not add bright realistic, a photo of, already implies realism. Do not add bright realistic vary language and sentence rhythm between prompts. Vary language and sentence rhythm between prompts. Do not summarize or explain. Just describe scene by scene. Do not summarize or explain. Just describe scene by scene. Step 3. Output format. Return a single fenced JSON block. Characters. Name, full descriptor. Scenes, prompt, thumbnail prompt, URL. Content, a photo of most emotionally intense or visually shocking moment in the story, designed for thumbnail clickbait. Use high contrast, central composition, and an emotionally ambiguous or shocking gesture or prop. Favor tight framing and dramatic body language over environment. Example, a photo of Nora Vale, a 30-year-old white woman with pale skin and long, straight, dark brown hair, wearing a faded shawl and simple wool dress and sturdy boots, holding a bloodied bundle under her coat, eyes wide in fear as firelight flickers on her face. Prompt. Scene 1, prompt, 00000030. Content. Dear prompt. Scene 2, prompt, 003001 air. Content. Characters. Nora Vale, a 30-year-old white woman with pale skin and long, straight, dark brown hair, wearing a faded shawl and simple wool dress and sturdy boots with a faint wedding band on a leather string around her neck. Elias Brandt, a 35-year-old white man with weathered, ruddy skin, a square jaw, icy blue eyes, cracked lips, and short, coarse black hair with a short, dark beard, wearing a wool-lined canvas coat, leather gloves, and heavy trail boots, with a burn scar on his right cheek. Scene 1 prompt, 000030. A photo of Nora Vale, a 30-year-old white woman with pale skin and long, straight, dark brown hair, wearing a faded shawl and simple wool dress, and sturdy boots, with a faint wedding band on a leather string around her neck, stepping down from a snow-covered wagon. Her breath curls in the air as she scans the frozen valley, tense and watchful. Scene 2. Prompt, Rio 3001, arrow. A photo of Nora Vale, a 30-year-old white woman with pale skin and long, straight, dark brown hair, wearing a faded shawl and simple wool dress and sturdy boots, with a faint wedding band on a leather string around her neck, standing with her trunk at her feet, staring at a stone cabin under a pewter sky, her expression unreadable. Final reminders. Do not abbreviate or parenthesize character descriptions. Do not abbreviate or parenthesize character descriptions. Do not group characters under a single description block. Do not group characters under a single description block. Do not add bright, realistic, no AI look. A photo of already implies realism. Do not add bright, realistic, no AI look. A photo of already implies realism. Always use full clause-based character descriptors every time a character appears. Always use full clause-based character descriptors every time a character appears. Multi-character prompt rules, updated for Whisk. All characters must be physically close. No background, distant, off-frame positions. All characters must be physically close. No background, distant, off-frame positions. Every character must have a clear physical action, e.g., holding, sitting, reaching, placing, patting. Avoid abstract verbs like watching, connecting, hesitating. Every character must have a clear physical action, e.g., holding, sitting, reaching, placing, patting. Avoid abstract verbs like watching, connecting, hesitating. Show emotions through body language and actions, not symbolic phrasing. Show emotions through body language and actions, not symbolic phrasing. End every prompt with a concrete physical environment descriptor, e.g., on the porch under orange sunset light, inside the kitchen with firelight flickering. End every prompt with a concrete physical environment descriptor, e.g., on the porch under orange sunset light, inside the kitchen with firelight flickering. Never describe characters as simply standing. Always include an object or gesture. Never describe characters as simply standing. Always include an object or gesture. If 3 characters appear, one must perform the primary action, the others must physically respond or assist. If 3 characters appear, one must perform the primary action, the others must physically respond or assist. Always specify which hand does what when interacting with others or objects. Always specify which hand does what when interacting with others or objects. Only use one dynamic environment element per prompt, e.g., wind, firelight, rain. Only use one dynamic environment element per prompt, e.g., wind, firelight, rain. Always specify light source and direction, e.g., warm firelight on their faces. Always specify light source and direction, e.g., warm firelight on their faces. Use spatial anchors when needed. A photo taken from inside the cabin. From the porch looking outward. Use spatial anchors when needed. A photo taken from inside the cabin. From the porch looking outward. Every inanimate object that supports character interaction, e.g., wagon, doorframe, chair, window, blanket, must include at least one concrete adjective, e.g., wooden, covered, heavy, iron-rimmed, to ensure the object is recognized as a physical part of the scene. Every inanimate object that supports character interaction, e.g., wagon, doorframe, chair, window, blanket, must include at least one concrete adjective, e.g., wooden, covered, heavy, iron-rimmed, to ensure the object is recognized as a physical part of the scene. This helps the AI correctly frame and render the environment as intended. Examples: down from a covered wagon, onto a low wooden stool, at a heavy oak table, down from a wagon. Ambiguous, often ignored by AI. Await user's pasted story, then output. Never include spoken lines in quotation marks, e.g., thank you, or verbs of speech, e.g., says, whispers, asks, in any prompt. Never include spoken lines in quotation marks, e.g., thank you, or verbs of speech, e.g., says, whispers, asks, in any prompt. AI models will often interpret these as literal text and render speech bubbles or written words into the image. This breaks the realism and cinematic style. Instead, describe the emotion or intent through body language and facial expression. His expression filled with gratitude. She bows her head in silent apology. He grips the edge of the doorway, eyes wide with disbelief. Avoid. He says, thank you. She whispers, come back. He asks, are you afraid? Always externalize emotion through gesture, posture, or physical context. Every time a character is mentioned in a prompt, their full visual descriptor must be repeated in natural clause format, e.g., Anya Volkov, a 30-year-old white woman with pale skin. Every time a character is mentioned in a prompt, their full visual descriptor must be repeated in natural clause format, e.g., Anya Volkov, a 30-year-old white woman with pale skin. Never use bear names, e.g., Anya Volkov, Caleb Bell, and Sadie Bell. This rule is absolute. No skipping, abbreviating, or grouping characters under a shared name block. 14. Thumbnail rules. Scene 0. Prompt. Always begin the prompt sequence with a dedicated thumbnail scene. This image must capture the most emotionally or visually explosive beat from the story, be framed for maximum contrast and curiosity. Feature at least one key character using full descriptor. Prefer ambiguous gestures, High-stakes props, blood, bundles, weapons, tears, firelight, and tight composition use wording that evokes tension and invites questions, e.g., clutching something hidden, reaching out in the dark, turning away with tears in her eyes, kneeling with a smoking revolver in hand, avoid wide shots or landscape focus. This prompt is only for use as the YouTubed video thumbnail image, not part of the linear narrative sequence. Full character list using natural clause format. Full character list using natural clause format 20-30 scene prompts with timestamps, each following this updated structure. 20-30 scene prompts with timestamps, each following this updated structure, awaiting story input. The hammer wasn't just a tool in Jedediah's hand. It was a judgment. Each blow echoed off the silent faces of the townsfolk, a rhythm of ruin. He drove the nail deep into the weathered pine of the old storehouse door, the wood groaning in protest. He wasn't just posting a notice. He was crucifying a reputation, Eliza's reputation. He pinned the crude, hand-painted sign for the whole town of Redemption to see. The words were a stark, black wound against the gray wood. Unclaimed bride. Jedediah spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust, a final, ugly punctuation mark on her public shame. Her crime wasn't theft or murder. Her crime was being left behind. Her mail-order husband, a man she'd never met, hadn't shown up at the stagecoach stop. And in a town like Redemption, a woman with no man, no family, and no money was less than nothing. She was a problem to be solved. Eliza stood frozen on the steps of the mercantile, a half-empty sack of flour clutched in her hands. The whispers started instantly, a low, coiling hiss of pity and contempt. Her name, the only thing she truly owned, was being turned to ash. She was ruined, utterly. But it wasn't the shaming that made her blood run cold. It was the lie. She knew exactly why her intended hadn't shown, and it was a secret that could get her killed. A man detached himself from the shadows of the livery stable. He moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose that cut through the crowd's noise. It was Silas Blackwood, a rancher who kept to himself, his land so far up in the unforgiving hills that most folks only saw him a few times a year. He wasn't a man known for interfering. He was a man known for his silence. He didn't look at Eliza. He didn't look at Jedediah. He walked straight to the storehouse door. His hand, calloused and scarred, wrapped around the edge of the wooden sign. With a single sharp pull, he ripped it free, the nails screeching in protest. The sound was deafening in the sudden quiet. Jedediah took a step forward, his hand dropping to the pistol on his hip. "That ain't your business, Blackwood." Silas didn't flinch. He broke the plank over his knee with a crack that made people jump. He tossed the two pieces into the dust. Then, and only then, did he turn his gaze to Eliza. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held a look she couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity. It was something harder. Something that looked a lot like recognition. He took a step toward her. The crowd held its breath. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. "He took your name. I'm offering you mine." The collective gasp was a physical thing. Jedediah's face went from white to purple. "You're insane," he stammered. "She's worthless. She needs a husband," Silas said, his eyes never leaving Eliza's. "And my ranch needs a woman's hand." He extended his hand, not to help her, but as if sealing a deal. "It's a fair trade. My name for your silence." His name for her silence. What did that even mean? Her mind reeled. This was madness. Marry a stranger? A recluse who lived miles from civilization? But what was the alternative? Starvation. Being run out of town. A life of scorn and whispered insults. She looked from Silas's steady, unreadable face to Jedediah's sputtering rage, and she saw her choice. It wasn't a choice between two men. It was a choice between a quick death and a slow one. She dropped the sack of flour. It hit the ground with a soft thud. She took his hand. The wagon ride to his ranch was a study in quiet desperation. Silas Blackwood didn't speak a word. He just handled the reins, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the winding path that climbed higher and higher into the desolate rocky hills. Eliza sat beside him, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. She had left everything behind. Her small rented room, her job sewing, the few friends she thought she had. All gone. Swapped for a stranger's name and a ride into the unknown. Why had he done it? The question hammered in her skull with every jolt of the wagon. No man in his right mind would take on a shamed woman, an unclaimed woman. It was a stain that would spread to him, to his name, to his land. Unless he was just as much of an outcast as she was. Maybe that was it. Misery finding company. The sun began to dip low, painting the stony peaks in shades of orange and blood. The air grew colder. Finally, after hours that felt like years, he pulled the horses to a stop. "We're here," he said. It wasn't a ranch, not like the sprawling thorn empire that choked the valley. It was a cabin. A small, sturdy-looking thing made of dark, weathered logs with a stone chimney and a modest corral nearby. It was stark. It was lonely. It was the most isolated place she had ever seen. He helped her down from the wagon, his touch brief and impersonal. "The well is over there. House has 2 rooms. You'll take the one on the left. I sleep in the main room." He spoke of logistics, not welcome, of arrangements, not marriage. It was a business transaction, and he was laying out the terms. As he unhitched the horses, Eliza walked to the cabin door. It was solid, built to withstand the harshest winters. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The main room was sparse but clean. A fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a cot in the corner. But it was the second door, the one to her room, that caught her eye. It was different from the rest of the cabin. The wood was newer, smoother. And on it, at the height a small child might reach, was a single, faded carving of a wildflower, a columbine. It was a small detail, a touch of softness in this brutally hard place. It made no sense. It was a crack in the stone facade of Silas Blackwood. She reached out and traced the carving with her finger, a strange shiver running down her spine. This place had secrets, and she had a terrifying feeling that she had just traded her own prison for a much larger, more mysterious one. The first week was a silent negotiation. They moved around each other like ghosts in the small cabin. Silas would be gone before dawn, tending to his few dozen cattle, mending fences that seemed to stretch into infinity. Eliza would wake to the smell of coffee he left simmering on the stove and the sound of his axe splitting wood outside. She learned the rhythms of his life without him ever speaking them. She took over the cabin, cleaning it with a ferocity born of desperation. She needed to prove her worth, to show him this trade wasn't one-sided. She scrubbed the floors, patched his worn shirts, and discovered a small, neglected vegetable garden behind the house. She weeded and watered it, coaxing life back into the parched soil. It was honest work, and it kept her hands busy. It kept her mind from spiraling. But the silence stretched and strained. Meals were eaten with only the sound of forks scraping against tin plates. Every night she would lie in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his steady breathing from the other room. He never tried her door. He never approached her. He was a perfect gentleman, a perfect stranger. And that was more unnerving than anything else. One evening, he came back later than usual, a dark line of exhaustion etched around his mouth. He carried a newborn calf in his arms, its mother having died during the birth. He laid it gently on a bed of hay near the hearth. "It's weak," he said, the first unsolicited words he'd spoken to her in days. "Probably won't make it through the night." Eliza looked at the tiny, shivering creature. She saw her own reflection in its fragile struggle. She knelt down, dipping a clean rag in a bowl of warm milk she'd set aside from their meager supply. She gently squeezed the corner of the rag into the calf's mouth. It was a trick her father, a farmer, had taught her long ago. Silas watched her, his expression unreadable. He didn't stop her. He just watched, a silent sentinel in the flickering firelight. For hours, they worked together without speaking. He would hold the calf steady while she coaxed more milk into it. At one point, her hand brushed against his. His skin was rough, but there was a warmth there that startled her. He pulled his hand back quickly as if burned. By dawn, the calf was standing on wobbly legs, nudging her hand for more. It had survived. Silas was staring into the fire, his back to her. "You're good with animals," he said, his voice quiet. "My father taught me," she replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that chilled her to the bone. "Being good with the young, that's a gift, a cruel one sometimes." He was talking about her, about the sign, about her being unclaimed, and by extension, childless. It was the first time he had acknowledged the reason she was here. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded almost like a confession, like he understood a pain he had no right to know. She looked at his broad, lonely back and realized the silence in this cabin wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken things, of griefs so heavy they didn't need words to fill the space. The question of why he'd saved her still haunted her, but a new one was beginning to form. What, or who, was Silas Blackwood hiding from, all the way out here? The trip to town was unavoidable. Supplies were running low, and Silas needed to sell a few hides. He announced it at breakfast, his tone flat and non-negotiable. "We leave in an hour." Eliza's stomach twisted into a knot, facing Redemption Gulch again, facing the whispers and the stares, but she wouldn't show weakness, not in front of him. She simply nodded, packed a small basket with the mended shirts she planned to trade for thread, and climbed onto the wagon when the time came. The town felt different. The air was thick with judgment. As they rode down the main street, windows twitched with unseen watchers. People on the boardwalk would stop their conversations, their eyes following the wagon, their lips moving in silent condemnation. It was as if she were a disease, and Silas, by association, was now infected. He seemed oblivious, his face a mask of indifference. He pulled up in front of the Mercantile, the very spot where her old life had ended. "I'll be at the assayer's office," he said, not looking at her. "Stay here." It was a command, not a suggestion, an order to remain in the lion's den. She watched him walk away, his long strides sure and steady. He didn't look back. Eliza took a deep breath and slid down from the wagon seat. She had to do this. She clutched her basket and walked toward the Mercantile's door. Just as she reached for the handle, it swung open. It was Jedediah Thorne. His face, usually handsome and smug, was blotchy with rage. His eyes burned with a hatred that was almost manic. "Look what the cat dragged in," he sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "The unclaimed bride and her hermit husband. Come to show off your great bargain, Eliza?" She tried to push past him, but he blocked her way. "Don't you ignore me. You think you've won? You think hiding away in that shack with that silent freak changes anything? You're still unclaimed. You're still nothing." Her blood ran hot and cold. "Let me pass, Jedediah." "Or what?" he challenged, leaning closer, his breath sour with whiskey. "You'll have your new protector come save you? Blackwood can't protect you from what you are." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Everyone knows. Everyone will always know. Get your hand off my wife." The voice was ice. It cut through the street noise like a razor. Silas stood 10 feet away, his body coiled like a spring. He hadn't raised his voice, but every single person on the street had heard him. His wife. He'd said it. He'd claimed her, publicly. Jedediah laughed, a ragged, ugly sound. Wife, you married damaged goods, Blackwood, a broken wagon, an empty well. Silas took a slow step forward. I said, let her go. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed Jedediah would refuse. His grip on Eliza's arm tightened. But then he saw something in Silas's eyes, something that made the color drain from his face. He released her abruptly, shoving her backward. She's all yours, Jedediah spat, trying to recover his swagger. Enjoy the silence in your home. It's all you'll ever get from her. Silas didn't even look at him. He walked past Jedediah as if he were a piece of furniture, his focus entirely on Eliza. He gently took her arm, his touch surprisingly soft as he examined the red marks Jedediah's fingers had left. Are you all right? He asked, his voice low, for her ears only. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, her throat tight with a confusing mix of fear, gratitude, and anger. He kept his hand on her arm, a silent gesture of ownership and protection, and led her into the mercantile. The storekeeper, who had been watching from the window, suddenly became very busy organizing a shelf of canned beans. The message was clear. They were on their own. Silas Blackwood had drawn a line in the sand, and in doing so he had declared war on the most powerful family in the valley. Eliza knew with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow that this was far from over, and Silas hadn't just saved her from public humiliation. He had chained himself to her fate. The question was he her savior or her fellow prisoner? The ride back was even quieter than the first. But the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was charged with the aftermath of the confrontation, heavy with unspoken questions. Silas's declaration, my wife, hung in the air between them. It was a lie, a convenience. But he had said it with such conviction, such cold authority, that it had felt real. When they reached the cabin, Eliza finally found her voice. Why? She asked, turning to him as he unhitched the horses. Why did you say that? Why did you do any of this? He continued his work, his movements methodical. It was the truth of our arrangement. No, it wasn't, she shot back, her frustration boiling over. The arrangement was your name and your home. You didn't have to defend me. You didn't have to make an enemy of the Thorns. You could have just let it be. He stopped, his back to her. And let him put his hands on you like that? Let him speak to you like that in the street? He turned slowly, his face like a thunderhead. No. But why? She insisted, taking a step closer. You don't know me. I'm a stranger, a burden, a woman shamed for being left behind. Why do you care? His eyes bored into hers. For a moment she thought he was going to tell her. She saw a flicker of something raw and painful in their depths. But then the mask slammed back down. A man's property is his own, he said, his voice flat and cold. He was on my land, so to speak. The words hit her like a slap. Property. That's all she was to him. A bargain he had struck. A piece of property he was now obligated to defend. The fragile hope that had begun to sprout in her chest withered and died. Of course. It was about his pride, his name. Not about her. She turned away, tears of anger and humiliation stinging her eyes. I see. She stalked into the cabin, slamming the door behind her. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, her body trembling. She was a fool to think there was anything more to his actions than a rigid, incomprehensible code of honor. Later that night, unable to sleep, she crept into the main room. He was asleep on his cot, one arm flung over his face. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows. Her eyes were drawn to a small, leather-bound trunk tucked away under his cot. It was the one piece of his life that seemed truly personal. Driven by a reckless need to understand the man who now owned her life, she knelt down. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, there weren't clothes or tools. There were memories. A stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a woman's silver locket, tarnished with age, and underneath it all, a tiny pair of leather baby shoes. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She picked up one of the shoes. It was so small, so impossibly small. It had been worn, the leather soft and creased. Silas Blackwood, the cold, silent cowboy, had a past he kept locked away in a trunk, a past that included a woman and a child. Suddenly, his words from the night they saved the calf echoed in her mind. Being good with the young? That's a gift. A cruel one sometimes. It wasn't about her. He hadn't been talking about her at all. He had been talking about himself. She looked from the tiny shoe in her hand to the sleeping man on the cot, and a devastating new possibility began to take shape. His protection wasn't about pride or property. It was about pain. And his silence wasn't emptiness. It was a tomb. The discovery of the trunk changed the way she saw him. Every time she looked at Silas now, she saw the ghost of the man he must have been. The man who had a wife, a child. The man whose life had been shattered so completely that he had retreated into this fortress of silence and solitude. His hardness was not a feature of his character. It was a scar. She never mentioned the trunk. It was a secret she now shared with his ghosts. Instead, she tried to chip away at his silence in other ways. She began to talk to him, filling the cabin with small, meaningless observations about the weather, the garden, the cattle. She didn't expect a response, and usually she didn't get one. But she was planting seeds, hoping one might someday take root in the barren ground of his grief. One afternoon, while mending a fence at the far edge of his property, she found a small, sheltered clearing. In the center stood a single, gnarled oak tree, and beneath it were two mounds of earth, marked by simple wooden crosses. There were no names carved into them. Just two silent testaments to a loss so profound it couldn't be spoken. She knew, instinctively, who was buried there: his wife, his child, the woman of the locket, and the owner of the tiny shoes. She began to visit the spot in secret, pulling the weeds that grew around the graves, sometimes leaving a small bundle of wildflowers she picked from the hillsides. It was her own silent conversation with the family he'd lost, a way of honoring the source of his pain. The thorns were not idle. A few days after the confrontation in town, Silas found one of his cattle dead by the creek, its belly swollen. Poison. A week later, a section of his fence was cut, and a half-dozen of his herd had wandered off, likely rebranded and absorbed into the Thorn Empire. These were warnings, small cuts meant to bleed him slowly. Silas grew even more withdrawn, his jaw perpetually tight. He started patrolling the property at night, a rifle in his hands, his face grim in the moonlight. Eliza watched him from the window, her heart aching for him. He was a man under siege, and she was the cause. "This is my fault," she said one evening, as he cleaned his rifle at the table. "If I had just left—" "Where would you have gone?" he cut in, not looking up from his work. "I don't know. Somewhere. Anywhere. You shouldn't have to fight my battles." He finally looked at her, his eyes dark. "These aren't your battles anymore. They're ours." Ours. The word hung between them, as solid and real as the table. It was the most he had ever offered, a partnership, a shared fate. That night a storm rolled in, a ferocious tempest that shook the small cabin. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. In the middle of the night, a deafening crack of thunder shook the house, followed by a splintering crash. Silas was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle. "Stay here," he ordered, and plunged out into the storm. Eliza waited, her heart pounding with every gust of wind. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She couldn't just sit there. Grabbing a lantern, she pulled a heavy oilskin coat over her nightdress and ran outside. The wind nearly tore the lantern from her hand. In the flickering light, she saw it. A massive branch from an old cottonwood had split and crashed down onto the roof of the small barn, caving in a section of it. She found Silas inside, struggling to pull a trapped horse from beneath the splintered beams. The animal was panicking, its eyes wide with terror. "The leg's pinned!" he yelled over the storm. "I can't move the beam alone!" There was no time to think. Eliza set the lantern down and grabbed the end of the massive beam. It was impossibly heavy. "Together!" she screamed. "On three! 1, 2, 3!" They heaved with everything they had. Muscles strained, sinew screamed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of stressed wood, the beam lifted, just an inch. It was enough. The horse scrambled free, limping but alive. They both collapsed back into the mud and rain, gasping for breath. They were soaked, shivering, and covered in grime. But they were smiling, a real shared smile of victory. In the chaotic lantern light, his face was stripped of its usual defenses. She saw not the silent cowboy, but a man, vulnerable, weary, and alive. He looked at her, at the rain plastering her hair to her face, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and his own expression softened. He reached out, his hand brushing a stray, wet strand of hair from her cheek. His touch lingered for a second too long. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the heart of the storm. The air crackled with something more than lightning. Then he pulled his hand back, the mask of indifference settling back into place, but not before she had seen it. Not before she knew that somewhere beneath the ice, there was a fire. The aftermath of the storm was a turning point. Repairing the barn became their shared project. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, sawing new beams, hammering shingles, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. The physical labor broke down the walls between them in a way words never could. Laughter, surprisingly, began to find its way into the cabin. It started small. A shared chuckle when a hammer slipped, a quiet smile when one of their two chickens managed to sneak inside and steal a crumb. The oppressive silence was receding, replaced by a fragile companionship. One evening, exhausted and sore, they sat at the table sharing a simple meal of potatoes and salted pork. "I never asked you," Eliza said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "The names on the crosses. I don't know their names." Silas froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The air grew still. He stared down at his plate for a long time, and she thought he would retreat back into his shell, that she had pushed too far. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with rust. "Sarah," he said. "Her name was Sarah." He paused, swallowing hard. "And Lily, our daughter. She was 4. He said their names like prayers, like fragile things he was afraid to break by speaking them aloud. "What were they like?" Eliza whispered, her heart aching for him. He looked up, and for the first time, he let her see the full depth of his grief. His eyes were oceans of it. "Sarah, she could make anything grow. She planted that garden out back. Said this land wasn't angry, just lonely. She had a laugh that could shame the devil." He managed a ghost of a smile. "Lily, she was all fire and light. She loved the wildflowers, especially the columbines. She used to draw them everywhere." The carving on the door, it was Lily's. "She caught the fever first," Silas continued, his voice a low monotone, as if reciting a story he had told himself 1,000 times. "Then Sarah. I rode for the doctor in Redemption. Rode the horse half to death. By the time we got back, he trailed off, the words failing him. They were gone. The whole town whispered it was my fault, for living so far out, for choosing this lonely land. They looked at me like I had killed them myself." Now she understood. His exile was self-imposed, but it had been forged in the town's judgment. He knew what it was like to be branded, to be condemned by whispers. When he saw them shaming her, he wasn't just seeing a stranger in need, he was seeing himself 5 years earlier. "You defended me because you understood," she breathed. "I understood the cruelty," he corrected, his voice gaining a hard edge. Jedediah Thorne stood there, passing judgment, and the whole town just let him. They fed on it, just like they fed on my grief. He stood up abruptly, the conversation too much for him. He went to the window, staring out into the darkness. The Thorns, they think they own this valley. They think they can decide who is worthy and who is not, who lives and who is cast out. Eliza came and stood beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her presence. "And what do you think, Silas?" He was silent for a moment, the only sound the chirping of crickets outside. "I think," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "a man reaps what he sows. And Jedediah Thorne has been planting bitter seeds for a very long time." A cold dread washed over Eliza. This wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about retribution. Silas wasn't just defending his property. He was preparing to fight an old war, and he had just drafted her as his soldier. The fragile peace they had built felt like the calm before a storm far greater than the one that had broken the barn. The next time they went to town, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't just hostile. It was threatening. Jedediah had been nursing his wounded pride, and it had festered into something ugly. He'd spread rumors that Silas was not just a recluse, but a madman, that he'd stolen Eliza away, that he was a danger to the good people of Redemption Gulch. As Silas conducted his business, Eliza saw Jedediah's father, the elder Mr. Thorne, watching them from the porch of the saloon. He was a big man, with a face like a slab of granite and cold, calculating eyes. He was the true power in the valley, and his stare promised trouble. Later that day, as they were loading their wagon, the town sheriff approached them. He was a small, weaselly man who always seemed to be sweating, his loyalty to the Thorns an open secret. "Blackwood," the sheriff said, not quite meeting his eyes, "Mr. Thorne has lodged a complaint. Says you've been trespassing on his northern range." "My property line is clearly marked," Silas said, his voice level. "Well, he sees it differently," the sheriff shrugged. "He's also put in a claim for a dozen head of cattle he says match the description of yours. Says they wandered onto his land." The message was clear. This was theft, sanitized by the law. "That's a lie," Eliza blurted out before she could stop herself. The sheriff finally looked at her, a contemptuous sneer on his lips. "Ma'am, a woman in your position would be wise to stay quiet." Silas took a step forward, placing himself between Eliza and the sheriff. His hand didn't go to his gun, but his whole body was a weapon. "The cattle are mine. The land is mine. If Thorne has a problem, he can talk to me directly." "Oh, he will," the sheriff said, backing away. "He surely will." The threat materialized 2 days later. Eliza was feeding the chickens when she saw the riders, a half-dozen of them, with Thorne and Jedediah at their head. They weren't coming for a conversation. They rode with the grim purpose of men who intended to take, not ask. Silas came out of the cabin, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He didn't look surprised. He looked like he'd been waiting for this. "Blackwood!" Thorne bellowed, pulling his horse to a stop just outside the corral. "You've got something of mine, a dozen head of cattle, and you've been poaching on my land?" "You're mistaken," Silas said, his voice calm but carrying across the yard. "I'm never mistaken," Thorne growled. "We're here to collect what's ours, and to deliver a message. This valley doesn't have room for troublemakers, or their damaged women." Jedediah smirked from behind his father. "We'll take the cattle, and then maybe we'll take her back too. Find some use for her." Rage, pure and white-hot, surged through Eliza. These men had tried to destroy her, and now they were trying to destroy the one person who had shown her kindness. She marched out of the cabin and stood beside Silas, her fear eclipsed by her fury. "You will not set one foot on this land," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Thorne laughed. "Look at that. The unclaimed bride has found her tongue." He looked at his men. "Go get the cattle." As two of the riders started toward the pasture, Silas raised his rifle. "I wouldn't." The air crackled. The riders hesitated, looking back at Thorne. No one had ever defied him like this. "You'd shoot a man over a few cows, Blackwood?" Thorne challenged, his hand moving toward his own pistol. "I'd shoot a man for trying to take what's mine," Silas replied, his eyes like chips of flint. "And everything on this land is mine." His gaze flickered to Eliza for a fraction of a second, and in that look she understood. He wasn't talking about cattle anymore. It was a standoff, a silent, deadly calculation of risk and reward. Thorne had the numbers, but Silas had the high ground, and a look in his eye that promised he would take at least two of them with him. But there was something Silas didn't know, something Eliza hadn't told him, a secret from her own past that was about to change the odds completely. Before she was the unclaimed bride, Eliza had been a bookkeeper. Back in Ohio, she'd worked for her father's small freight company. She knew ledgers, she knew numbers, and she knew how greedy men cooked their books. When her intended husband's letters stopped coming, she hadn't just packed her bags, she'd gotten suspicious. His last letter had spoken of a major land deal he was making in Redemption Gulch with the Thorne family. He'd boasted of the profits to come. Then, silence. She'd used the last of her savings not just to travel west, but to investigate. In the territorial capital, she'd spent a week in the dusty records office. What she found was a pattern of land fraud so blatant it was breathtaking. The Thorne family had been using shell companies and forged documents to swallow up smaller ranches for a fraction of their worth. Her intended hadn't abandoned her. He had likely uncovered the same truth and been silenced for it. She had proof. Copies of the forged deeds tucked away in the false bottom of her travel trunk. That was her silence. The secret she was trading for Silas's name. She looked at Thorne, at his arrogant, confident face. She looked at his men, and she knew this wasn't a fight they could win with guns. But maybe they could win it with the truth. "Mr. Thorne," Eliza said, her voice ringing out in the sudden quiet, sharp and clear. "Before you start a war you can't finish. Perhaps you'd be interested in discussing the Northern Valley land grant of 72. The elder Thorne's face went slack. The color drained from his cheeks. It was a subtle reaction, but Silas, watching him like a hawk, saw it. "Or perhaps," Eliza continued, pressing her advantage, "we could talk about the 3 ranches you acquired through the Redemption Mining and Timber Company, a corporation that, according to the territorial records, doesn't actually exist." Thorne's men were looking at him now, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning suspicion. Jedediah looked like he'd been slapped. "I don't know what you're talking about," Thorne blustered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Don't you?" Eliza said, a cold smile touching her lips. "Then I suppose you won't mind if my husband rides to the Capitol tomorrow with the documents I have locked in my trunk. The ones that prove your entire empire is built on a foundation of lies and stolen land. I imagine the federal marshal would find them very interesting reading." For a long, heart-stopping moment, no one moved. The sound of the wind was the only thing in the world. Thorne looked from Eliza's unblinking gaze to Silas's ready rifle, and he saw the checkmate. He was a powerful man, but his power was built on a lie, and she had just pulled the pin on the grenade that would blow it all apart. "This is not over," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his posse trailing behind him in a cloud of dust and confusion. The silence they left behind was heavy with the echo of Eliza's bombshell. Silas slowly lowered his rifle, his eyes fixed on her. The look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated shock. He had thought he was saving a helpless woman. He had just discovered he'd allied himself with a master strategist. "My name for your silence," he said, repeating his own words back to her, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "That's what you were hiding." "That's what I was trading," she corrected him gently. He looked at her, at the woman who had just faced down the most powerful man in the valley with nothing but a handful of paper and an iron will. He saw not a victim, not a burden, but an equal, a partner. A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, and it was like watching the sun rise. "Well then, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, the name no longer a lie, but a title she had earned. "It seems I got the better end of this bargain after all." Their victory was not won with bullets, but with truth. Thorne, exposed and facing federal investigation, was ruined. His empire crumbled. The ranchers whose land he had stolen banded together, and with Eliza's evidence, they reclaimed what was theirs. Redemption Gulch, a town once choked by one family's greed, began to breathe again. And on the small, isolated ranch in the hills, something new began to grow. The silence between Silas and Eliza was replaced by conversation. He told her about Sarah and Lily, showing her the locket, the letters, the tiny shoes. He unburdened his heart, and she held his grief with a gentle strength. She, in turn, told him about the man she had been supposed to marry, about her suspicions, about the quiet investigation that had brought her to his doorstep. They discovered they were not just two broken people who had found each other. They were two survivors who had been fighting the same war from different directions. They repaired the barn together. They planted a new garden, their hands working in the same soil. And one night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, he took her hand. "The arrangement," he said, his voice quiet. "It doesn't have to be just an arrangement, if you're willing." She looked at him, at the man who had offered her his name when she had nothing, who had stood beside her when the world turned against them. "I've been your wife for months, Silas," she said softly. "I think it's time I started being your partner, too." He slid the silver locket that had belonged to his Sarah into her palm. "Then I think," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "this belongs to you now." Their life was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It was steady. It was a partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect and a hard-won peace. They had found in each other not a savior, but an ally. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and built something new, something stronger. And the small cabin, once a fortress of solitude and grief, became what it had always been meant to be. It became a home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe.